I shall know him, I shall know him, by the print of the nails in his hand. I shall know him, I shall know him, and redeemed by his side I shall stand. I shall know him by the print of the nails in his hand.
Hello, we're in this series. It probably will be 4 or 5 videos, and the purpose of them will be to share with you people in each century who believed in the rapture, who believed in the idea that Christ would come in the air and we would meet him in the air. Believers would be resurrected from the dead, and those who are alive to meet Christ in the air, then the tribulation here on earth, but that the Christians would not be in it. They would have already been raptured, and that there will be a millennial kingdom, and Christ will come to establish this millennial kingdom, 1,000-year kingdom on earth.
And with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Wherefore, comfort one another with these words. And I'm going to just go to John of Damascus now, who lived from 675 to 749 as an Eastern Christian. He commented on 1 Thessalonians 4:16 to 17. And the Eastern Christians did not become amillennial as quick as the Western Christians did, because they didn't have Augustine as an influence. But at any rate, eventually they did switch over and join the Western side. But they noted that believers will rise separately to meet Christ. And he describes, John does, John of Damascus, describes the resurrection to life as an upgathering in the air, clarifying, if in anything, this is a pre-tribulation escape. So the tribulation's getting underway and God's snatching them out of the scene, according to John. In the 7th century, Bede the Venerable was a Western historiographer, and he commented on Revelation 3:10, 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17, by pointing out that God preserves his church at the end of time, possibly before the Great Tribulation. He didn't say any more, but he made it clear that he believed that. Now, I've already referred to John of Damascus, but he discusses earlier sects who had played a literal focus on Christ's return, and I mentioned him in my previous one, but now he's talking about the Montanists, but now he's talking about the Cathari, and he's writing as a historiographer would. He writes and mentions a group called the Cathari in his book. He notes their belief in a spiritual ascent for the pure. And he noted they also rejected remarriage. And he was unsure how they understood the glorification of a bodily resurrection. So he was quite confused about what the Catharis believed. But though he was regrettably mistaken on many counts, he still makes it very clear that there were those who were assessing this and realizing there were some views. The Cathari, teaching on an ascent of the spiritual pure, were just separatist believers, and the name Cathari was attached to them. It was not their name, it was a name of derision. And they taught that believers were caught up, had a caught up moment for believers, that was distinct from anything to do with Catholicism, resurrection theology. They didn't get along, you could see. However, his references, I'm back on mentioning the references of John of Damascus, are brief and based on earlier sources like Epiphanes of Salamis in the 4th century. He describes the sect called the Cathari, and he notes their rejection of Catholic allegorical interpretations of eschatology and the Catholic dogma insisting on one single and final resurrection. He says they didn't believe. The lack of surviving texts from these groups, frankly, makes it very hard to pin down exactly how and in what way the Cathari or other different groupings of that time actually taught and what they believed. All of what they wrote and any books they had were destroyed by fire, and they themselves suffered greatly for their faith. But there is a very clear thread of teachers that we can see who believed in the upgathering of saints among the Cathari. It's also clear that this sect or group of people were very numerous and were in large numbers, and they irritated and sometimes exhausted the spiritual leadership of Catholicism during the 8th to 12th centuries. And they were really the enemies of the Catholic Church, and the Catholics spent a long time dealing with them. Now, in the 9th to 11th centuries, I'm going to group people that I know had overlapping beliefs on this subject. The Paulicians, the Novatians, the Priscillianists, the Thorax, the Petrobusians, the Henricians, the Pasagini. All of these have been accused of being dualist and we're told by most historians that there was an anti-clerical, anti-church opposition to the Roman Catholic hierarchy, which was probably true. Their views regarding this so-called spiritual ascent have been greatly misrepresented by historians and authors who held bias toward these non-Catholic groups. And they were always engaged in efforts to try to convert them or destroy these movements, whichever they could. Since their detractors wanted to take every possible opportunity to declare them as heretics, their teachings on any spiritual or physical upgathering has simply not been established at this stage. Nonetheless, they were quite literal in their general interpretation of the messages of the gospel, salvation, love and hope, and a coming kingdom on earth. So we knew they were not allegorical in their interpretation. They believed in a literal heaven and earth. They believed in a real hell. Only time will tell if new discoveries and translations will shed more light on their end times or eschatological views. We'll have to wait and see. Starting with the Bogomils, it's especially common for their enemies, Roman Catholicism usually, to accuse them of teaching a dualist theology. That's just a standard thing. My research just does not defend that that was the case. The Bogomils, centered in and around Bulgaria from the 900s to 1100s, was commonly accused of believing in a spiritual ascent of souls to the good God, distinct from the bodily resurrection, which many of their detractors believed was due to them rejecting the material world or viewing it as evil. But we know these men were imposing, these detractors, these opponents to the Bogomils. We know they were trying to reword what they said into Gnostic language so they could falsely accuse them. So it's very hard to take a line on this. The Cathar text that we do have, circa 1200, describes souls being freed from the material world to join the divine, which some Catholics and some later humanist scholars question what was actually meant. The idea of a changed or glorified body was often mistaken or falsely interpreted, as I've already said, as latent Gnostic thinking. But everybody's accused of that, and I'm sure I'm accused of that by Catholics if I were given the opportunity. But this was not the case in most instances. It is relevant for anyone, any real understanding of these early believers, that we recognize that modern evangelical believers also see these passages like 1 Thessalonians 4:17, using the terms changed and caught up and a glorification process and an imminent rapture. Certainly, Catholic clerics and theologians' criticisms were totally disingenuous when they accuse non-Catholics or us of being Gnostics or dualists. But that's what they understand, because they do not understand the scriptures in a literal way. The spiritual event being taught by Cathars may be justly understood, and in my opinion, reconsidered as the literal interpretation and teaching of believers today. Consider believers to be perfect or complete in Christ. I think perfect is a King James phrase, or complete in Christ, or glorified and quite close to ideas, I'd say, aligned with dispensationalists today. That the Cathars rejected an unchanged physical body with the rapture event does not make them spiritualist or Gnostic. It just meant that physical body undergoes a change. When we see Christ, we will be like him. We will be as he is. And we know he had a glorified body when he came back to see the disciples after his resurrection. So why is it libelous, or why are we being defamed if we say one day we may have bodies similar to Christ? So down through the centuries, the Catholic inquisitors used this term Gnostic or dualist to disparage separatist congregations. But the point is, what did they really believe when they were busy disparaging them and falsely accusing them? What was really being said when their words were being twisted? Well, I have to be careful. I don't want to get carried away, but I do want to say that that tactic of calling people Gnostics or dualists, when there is no other reason to believe they were so, there's no link to Platonism, there's no link to Zoroastrianism, there's none of these ideas that went with the Gnostic thoughts, that they're just being irrational when they accuse us. Bogomil teachings, as they're recorded, the little bit that we have that's available to us. One Cosmos, a Catholic priest in the 10th century, suggests that these independent or separatist sects held to a Gnostic-like belief in the soul's ascent to heaven for the faithful, and that it was something distinct from any general resurrection, which was a Catholic idea. And he said we must reject them. Well, I understand from his position that's what he would think. But the Cathars and Bogomils, as far as we can tell, were just reading the Bible. And they were just aligning themselves with what it said, that we would be caught up and that it would be for believers only, and that there was no additional resurrection for these people. That was their resurrection. Well, I'm going to take you next, in the next session, into the 12th century with Jehoiakim of Fior, very important figure on this subject, but we'll stop for now.
I shall know him by the print of the nail.